September 8, 1944. 6:43 in the evening. Hans Friedrich sat in a concrete bunker at Peenemünde, watching a grainy film projector flicker against the wall. The images showed London. Staveley Road in Chiswick, to be precise. What had been Staveley Road? Because 24 hours earlier, the first operational V-2 rocket had fallen there at supersonic speed with no warning, and 960 kilograms of high explosive. The projector showed a crater 10 meters wide, shattered houses, emergency workers pulling bodies from rubble, a woman's shoe on the pavement, a child's stuffed rabbit half buried in bricks. Hans was 38 years old. He had worked on rocket guidance systems for 4 years. He understood gyroscopes, accelerometers, trajectory calculations. He could explain in technical detail how the V-2's guidance system kept the rocket stable during flight. What he could not explain was why his hands were shaking as he watched the film, why his stomach felt like it was filled with broken glass, why he kept staring at that stuffed rabbit in the rubble. 3 people had died in that first strike. Ada Harrison, age 63. Sapper Bernard Browning, age 31, home on leave. And a 3-year-old girl whose name Hans would not learn until much later. Oh, the Nazi propaganda officer narrating the film called it a great success. The first strike of Germany's miracle weapon. Proof that German science was superior. Revenge for the Allied bombing of German cities. The men in the bunker cheered. Hans did not cheer. He was thinking about his daughter. Her name was Anna. She had been 6 years old. She died on August 17, 1943, exactly 1 year and 3 weeks before this film was shown. British bombers had targeted Peenemünde that night in Operation Hydra. The raid was supposed to destroy the rocket production facilities. Instead, many bombs fell on the housing settlement where the scientists and technicians lived with their families. Anna had been in bed when the bombs fell. The house collapsed. Hans had dug through rubble with his bare hands for 7 hours. When he found her, she was holding a stuffed rabbit. Not the same rabbit as in the London footage, but similar enough that looking at the screen made Hans taste copper in his mouth. After Anna died, Hans had convinced himself that his work was justified. The British had killed his daughter. Now Germany would strike back. The V-2 was not just a weapon, it was justice. It was balance. It was the mathematics of revenge, an eye for an eye, a child for a child. The equations were simple and clean, and allowed him to sleep at night without dreaming of stuffed rabbits buried in rubble. But now, watching the film of Staveley Road, something in that equation broke. Because the 3-year-old girl in London was not the one who dropped bombs on Peenemünde. She had probably never even heard of Peenemünde. She was just a child who happened to live under the trajectory of a V-2 rocket that Hans had helped build. And suddenly, the mathematics did not work anymore. Because Anna was dead and the London girl was dead, and neither death canceled out the other. They just added together into a sum that made Hans want to vomit into the concrete floor. The projector shut off. The lights came on. SS Sturmbannführer Werner Klein stood at the front of the bunker. Klein was 29 years old and wore his uniform like a snake wore skin. He had been assigned to Peenemünde 6 months earlier to oversee security and ensure loyalty among the scientific staff. His eyes were the color of dirty ice, and he smiled like someone who had learned the expression from a manual. "Gentlemen," Klein said, "that was the first operational strike of the V-2 weapon system. Production quotas are now 900 rockets per month. Our Führer demands results. Any technical failures will be investigated thoroughly. Any sabotage will result in immediate execution." He paused. "Are there any questions?" No one asked questions. Asking questions around Klein was like sticking your hand into a wood chipper to see how sharp the blades were. The engineers filed out of the bunker. Hans walked back to his workshop in the technical assembly building with his colleague Kurt Schneider. Kurt was 44 years old, a specialist in fuel systems, a man who chain-smoked and told inappropriate jokes and had somehow maintained his sense of humor despite working in hell. "You look like death," Kurt said quietly as they walked. Hans did not answer. "What happened?" Kurt pressed. "You saw the film like everyone else. First strike, great success. The miracle weapon works. So why do you look like you are attending your own funeral?" Hans stopped walking. They were alone on the path between buildings. Overhead, floodlights created islands of brightness in the October darkness. In the distance, a test rocket ignited on the launch pad with a sound like God tearing a hole in the sky. "Kurt," Hans said slowly, "do you ever think about who we are killing?" Kurt lit another cigarette. His hands were steady. "We are killing the enemy, same as every other weapon in this war." Hans shook his head. "I mean, really think about it. The V2 has no guidance system for precision targeting. It just falls wherever the trajectory takes it. Residential areas, schools, hospitals. We are not hitting military targets. We are just dropping explosives on random civilians and hoping some of them are enemies." Kurt exhaled smoke. "You sound dangerously close to defeatism." "I sound like a father who watched his daughter die in an Allied bombing raid," Hans said, "and then spent a year convincing myself that revenge made it better. But it does not. It just creates more dead children, more stuffed rabbits in rubble." Kurt stared at him for a long moment. Then he grabbed Hans by the arm and pulled him into the shadow between two buildings. "Listen to me very carefully," he hissed. "You do not say things like that out loud. Klein has informants everywhere. If anyone hears you questioning the weapon program, you will be arrested. And when the SS arrests someone, they do not come back. Do you understand?" Hans nodded slowly, but his mind was already working on a different problem. Because he was an engineer. And engineers solved problems. And suddenly, he had a very specific problem to solve. How do you stop a rocket from killing people when you are the one building the rocket? The next morning, Hans arrived at his workstation in the Guidance Systems Assembly Hall at 0600 hours. The hall was 200 meters long and filled with rows of workbenches where technicians assembled the delicate components that kept V2 rockets flying straight. Each rocket required a guidance system consisting of 3 gyroscopes, 2 accelerometers, and a complex web of electrical relays. Hans's job was to calibrate the gyroscopes, making sure they spun at exactly the right speed, making sure they could detect even the smallest deviation from the planned trajectory, making sure the rocket flew exactly where it was aimed. But what if the gyroscope was slightly miscalibrated? Just a tiny error. 2 degrees off axis. Nothing that would show up in ground testing. Nothing that would prevent the rocket from launching, but enough that when the rocket reached apogee at 88 kilometers altitude and began its ballistic descent, the 2-degree error would compound. The rocket would miss its target by 2 or 3 kilometers. It would still explode, but it would explode in an empty field or a forest or the Thames River instead of on top of someone's house. Hans picked up the gyroscope he was supposed to calibrate. It was a beautiful piece of engineering, a spinning mass suspended on nearly frictionless bearings, precision machined to tolerances measured in microns. He placed it in the calibration jig and began making adjustments, but instead of calibrating it perfectly, he introduced a tiny error. Just 2 degrees, nothing visible, nothing measurable without specialized equipment. Then he marked the gyroscope as calibrated and moved it to the assembly queue. 1 gyroscope, 1 small error, 1 rocket that would miss its target and kill no one. But 1 rocket was not enough. There were 900 rockets per month being built now. One sabotage gyroscope out of 900 would save maybe 3 or 4 lives. The mathematics still did not balance. Hans needed a system, a way to sabotage multiple rockets without getting caught, a way to turn his workstation into a weapon against the weapon. Over the next 3 days, Hans watched the assembly process carefully, looking for opportunities, looking for gaps. The guidance systems moved through 5 different stations before final assembly. Hans worked at Station 2, calibrating gyroscopes. At Station 3, another technician installed the gyroscopes into the guidance frame. At Station 4, the accelerometers were added. At Station 5, the electrical systems were wired. At Station 6, the completed guidance unit was tested. The testing at Station 6 was the problem, because a properly trained technician could detect a miscalibrated gyroscope during testing. But Hans noticed something interesting. The testing station was chronically understaffed. 3 technicians trying to do the work of 6. They were rushing, cutting corners. Sometimes they would test only 1 gyroscope out of 3. Sometimes they would skip the accelerometer tests entirely. The pressure to meet production quotas was crushing quality control. Hans began sabotaging every 3rd gyroscope he calibrated, introducing small errors. Never the same error twice. Sometimes 2 degrees off axis, sometimes 3 degrees. Sometimes he would slightly loosen a bearing so the gyroscope would drift during flight. Sometimes he would introduce a tiny crack in the mounting bracket that would cause vibration. Each error was small enough to pass casual inspection, but large enough to throw off the rocket's trajectory by several kilometers. 3 weeks later, Hans had sabotaged approximately 60 rockets. He kept a careful count in a notebook written in a code only he understood. He told himself he was saving lives. He told himself Anna would have approved. He told himself the mathematics were starting to balance. But then Kurt Schneider appeared at his workstation one morning with a strange expression on his face. Kurt did not speak. He just gestured for Hans to follow him. They walked to the storage building where completed guidance systems waited for installation. Kurt pulled Hans into a dim corner behind a stack of crates. "How many?" Kurt asked quietly. Hans felt his heart stop. "What? How many have you sabotaged?" Kurt's voice was barely above a whisper. "Do not lie to me, Hans. I have been watching you for 2 weeks. I know what you are doing, so tell me. How many?" Hans stared at him, calculating whether he was about to die, whether Kurt was about to report him to Klein, whether the next sound he heard would be SS boots in the corridor. Finally, he spoke. 60, maybe 65, every 3rd gyroscope. Small errors, enough to miss the target by 2 or 3 kilometers. Kurt nodded slowly. Then he said something Hans did not expect. "Good, I want to help." Hans blinked. "What?" "I want to help you sabotage more rockets," Kurt repeated. "I work in fuel systems. I can introduce defects in the alcohol pumps. Make the engines cut out early. Some of the rockets will crash before they reach England. Others will fall short." He paused. "My brother lived in Hamburg. The July bombing killed him and his wife and his 2 children. I spent a year telling myself the V2 was revenge. But revenge does not bring anyone back. It just creates more dead families. So, if you are trying to stop that, I want to help." Hans felt something crack open in his chest. Relief or terror. Or maybe both. "Are you sure? If Klein finds out, we are both dead. Worse than dead. He will torture us first to find out if there are others." "I am sure," Kurt said, "because I have 3 children still alive in Berlin, and I do not want them growing up in a world where we killed thousands of people and told ourselves it was justified. So yes, I am helping you. Now tell me how many more we can sabotage without getting caught." They worked out a system. Hans would sabotage gyroscopes, Kurt would sabotage fuel systems. They would stagger the sabotage so not too many rockets from the same production batch would fail. They would vary their methods so the failures looked random rather than systematic. They calculated that they could safely sabotage 1 out of every 3 rockets without triggering an investigation. 100 rockets per month. 400 rockets over 4 months before the war would end. If each rocket would have killed an average of 3 people, they would save 1,200 lives. The mathematics were starting to look better. But in January 1945, the mathematics changed. Because someone else noticed the pattern. Too many rockets were missing their targets. Too many were crashing before reaching England. Too many were exploding in empty fields instead of on London neighborhoods. SS Sturmbannführer Klein ordered an investigation. Engineers were interrogated. Production records were examined. Quality control procedures were tightened. Klein announced that sabotage was suspected. Anyone with information about defects should report immediately. Anyone found to be sabotaging the miracle weapon would be executed along with their entire family. Hans and Kurt stopped sabotaging rockets. For 3 weeks they worked normally, calibrating gyroscopes perfectly, installing fuel systems without errors, watching rockets launch and fly straight and kill people. The mathematics reversed again, but Klein was still investigating. He was pulling production records, interviewing technicians, getting closer. On February 9, 1945, Klein arrested Dieter Hartmann, a junior engineer in electrical systems. Hartmann was 26 years old. He had never sabotaged anything, but he had made several innocent mistakes in his work. Mistakes that could look like sabotage if you squinted hard enough and needed someone to blame. Klein did not care about evidence, he cared about results. Hartmann was beaten for information he did not have. Then he was hanged in the assembly hall while all the technicians watched. Klein gave a speech about traitors and vigilance and the importance of the miracle weapon. Hans watched Hartmann's body swing from the ceiling beam and knew that death was meant for him. An innocent man had been executed to cover Hans's sabotage. The mathematics became very simple. 1 life lost to save hundreds. But Hans did not feel like a hero, he felt like a murderer. That night, Hans wrote a letter to his wife, telling her he loved her, telling her to stay safe, not telling her about the sabotage because if Klein found the letter, she would be arrested too. He sealed the letter and hid it under a floorboard in his quarters. Then he walked to Kurt's room. "We have to stop," Hans said. "Hartmann died because of what we did." "Hartmann died because Klein needed someone to blame," Kurt replied. "And tomorrow Klein will investigate someone else. And eventually he will figure out it was us. So we have 2 choices. We stop sabotaging rockets and watch thousands more people die. Or we keep going and accept that we might be caught." "What if we are caught?" Hans asked. "What if Klein tortures us? What if we break and tell him everything?" "Then we break and we die," Kurt said simply. "But until then, we keep working. Because I did the mathematics, Hans. We have sabotaged 127 rockets so far. If each rocket kills 3 people on average, we have saved 381 lives. Maybe more. Maybe one of those rockets would have hit a school and killed 50 children. Maybe one would have hit a hospital. The numbers are not exact, but they are better than 0. Hans sat down on Kurt's bunk. His hands were shaking again. "I keep seeing Hartmann's face." Kurt nodded. "I know, I see it too. But I also see my brother's children, the ones who died in Hamburg. And I think about all the other children we are saving. And that makes it possible to keep going." He paused. "The war is almost over, Hans. The Allies are 100 kilometers from Berlin. The V2 program will end soon one way or another. We just need to keep sabotaging for a few more weeks, maybe a month. Then it will not matter if Klein finds out because there will be no more rockets to build. Hans thought about Anna, about the stuffed rabbit, about the 3-year-old girl in London, about Dieter Hartmann swinging from a ceiling beam, about mathematics that balanced lives against lives and never came out even. Then he stood up. "Show me how to sabotage fuel systems," Hans said. "If we are doing this, we should sabotage more than just guidance systems. We should hit them everywhere. Gyroscopes, fuel pumps, electrical systems, structural welds. Make it look like the whole production line is falling apart instead of targeted sabotage. Make Klein think it is incompetence instead of rebellion." Kurt smiled for the first time in weeks. "Now you are thinking like an engineer." They resumed sabotage on February 12, 1945. Hans sabotaged gyroscopes. Kurt sabotaged fuel systems. They recruited no one else because every additional person increased the risk of discovery. They worked in silence. They kept no records except Hans's coded notebook. They watched rockets launch, and sometimes the rockets flew straight, and sometimes they tumbled or crashed or missed London by 5 kilometers and exploded in the countryside. Klein conducted more investigations. More engineers were interrogated, but the sabotage was too diffuse to trace. It looked like the entire production system was breaking down under pressure. On April 10, 1945, American troops entered Nordhausen and captured the Mittelwerk underground factory, where most V-2s were now being assembled. On April 17th, Soviet troops reached the Peenemünde area. Hans burned his coded notebook in a metal trash can and watched the pages turn to ash. The V-2 program was over. The war was almost over. And Hans had no idea if he had saved 400 lives or 4,000 lives because the mathematics of sabotage were impossible to calculate precisely. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would never tell anyone what he had done. Because heroes got medals and saboteurs got hanged, and Hans was both and neither, and the only way to survive was to stay silent forever. March 3, 1945, 4:17 in the morning. Kurt Schneider was screaming. Hans Friedrich could hear him through 2 concrete walls and a steel door. The sound was not human anymore. It was the noise a wounded animal makes when it knows death is coming but cannot understand why. Hans sat on his bunk in the technician quarters with his hands pressed against his ears, but the screaming came through anyway. The sound burrowed into his skull like a drill. Kurt had been in the interrogation room for 6 hours. SS Sturmbannführer Klein was personally conducting the questioning. Klein believed Kurt had sabotaged fuel systems. Klein was correct, but Kurt was not talking. Yet. Hans had not slept in 48 hours. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Klein's face. Imagined Klein asking questions. Imagined Klein showing photographs of miscalibrated gyroscopes. Imagined Klein saying, "We know what you did." Hans had sabotaged 89 gyroscopes so far. Kurt had sabotaged 38 fuel systems. Together they had destroyed or disabled 127 rockets. If Klein broke Kurt, if Kurt gave up Hans's name under torture, they would both hang. But worse than hanging was this: the waiting, the listening, the knowing that every scream was Kurt protecting Hans's secret with pieces of his own body. Another scream echoed through the walls, then a wet coughing sound, then silence. Hans opened his eyes. His hands were shaking so badly he had to grip the edge of the bunk to make them stop. His stomach felt like it was filled with broken glass. He had vomited twice in the last hour. There was nothing left to vomit now, but his body kept trying anyway. Dry heaves that left his ribs aching and his throat raw. The screaming started again. This time it was different. Higher pitched, more desperate. The sound a man makes when he has given up hope and is just begging for death. Hans stood up and walked to the window. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass. Outside, the sky was turning gray. In 6 hours, Hans would report to his workstation. He would calibrate gyroscopes. He would pretend everything was normal. He would pretend he could not hear Kurt dying 400 meters away. At 0600 hours, Hans walked to the assembly hall. His legs felt like they belonged to someone else. Each step required conscious effort. Left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. Do not think about Kurt. Do not think about Klein. Do not think about what happens when the screaming stops. Other technicians walked past him without speaking. Everyone knew about Kurt. Everyone understood what the screaming meant. In a place like Peenemünde, you kept your head down and your mouth shut, and you did not ask questions about the men who disappeared into rooms with SS officers and never came back. Hans's workstation was in the guidance systems section. Row 12, Station 4. The same place he had worked for 4 years. But today, there were 3 SS guards standing at the end of his row. Watching, taking notes, making sure every gyroscope was calibrated perfectly. Hans picked up the first gyroscope of the day. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped it. The gyroscope hit the workbench with a metallic clang. All 3 guards turned to look at him. Hans felt his heart stop. He picked up the gyroscope and placed it carefully in the calibration jig. One of the guards made a note on his clipboard. Hans forced his hands to be steady, forced his breathing to be normal, forced himself to work as if Kurt was not screaming 400 meters away. At 11:30 hours, the screaming stopped. Hans looked up from his workstation. Every technician in the assembly hall had stopped working. Everyone was listening. The silence was worse than the screaming because silence meant something had changed. Either Kurt had broken or Kurt was dead. Hans waited. 30 seconds. 1 minute. 2 minutes. No more screaming. Hans returned to calibrating gyroscopes, but his vision was blurring. He realized he was crying. Tears running down his face while his hands moved automatically through the calibration routine. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. One of the guards was watching him. Hans pretended he had something in his eye, pretended the tears were from dust or fatigue, not from listening to his friend die. At 1400 hours, Klein walked into the assembly hall. He was wearing his dress uniform, black with silver insignia. His boots made sharp clicking sounds on the concrete floor. He walked slowly down row 12, looking at each technician, studying faces. Hans kept his eyes on the gyroscope in front of him. Do not look up, do not make eye contact, do not give Klein any reason to notice you. But Klein stopped at Hans's workstation anyway. Herr Friedrich, Klein said quietly. His voice was soft, almost gentle. That was more frightening than shouting. How long have you worked with Kurt Schneider? Hans looked up. Klein's eyes were the color of dirty ice. 4 years, Sturmbannführer. We started at Peenemünde on the same day. Klein nodded slowly. He had a folder under his arm. He opened it and showed Hans a photograph. It was a fuel pump. The valve was cracked. A deliberate crack. Precise. Made by someone who knew exactly where to apply pressure to create a failure that would look accidental. Did Kurt Schneider ever discuss fuel systems with you? Klein asked. Hans forced himself to meet Klein's eyes, forced himself to speak clearly. No, Sturmbannführer. I work with guidance systems. Kurt worked with fuel. We rarely discuss technical matters outside our specialties. It was a lie. Hans and Kurt had discussed fuel systems extensively. They had planned together. They had calculated together. They had sabotaged together. But Klein could not prove that. Not unless Kurt had talked. Klein studied Hans's face for a long moment. Hans felt sweat running down his back. His heart was hammering so hard he was sure Klein could hear it. Then Klein closed the folder. Schneider died 1 hour ago, Klein said casually, as if he was discussing the weather. He did not provide any useful information before his death. He paused. That is unfortunate. Because I believe he had accomplices. I believe other technicians were involved in sabotaging rocket production, and I will find them. It is only a matter of time. Klein walked away. Hans gripped the edge of his workstation to keep from collapsing. Kurt was dead. Kurt had died without giving up Hans's name. Kurt had been tortured for 6 hours and had protected Hans until the very end. The mathematics of that were impossible to calculate. One life lost to protect another life. One friend dead so Hans could continue sabotaging. Hans felt bile rising in his throat. He turned and vomited into a metal trash can next to his workstation. The guards watched but did not approach. Vomiting was normal at Peenemünde. Everyone was sick from something. Fear, exhaustion, the knowledge that they were building weapons that killed children. At 18:30 hours, 2 SS guards carried something out of the interrogation building. Hans watched from the assembly hall window. The thing they were carrying was wrapped in canvas, but the shape was wrong. Too angular, too bent. Bodies were supposed to be straight when you carried them. This body was folded in places it should not fold. One arm hung out from under the canvas. The hand was purple and swollen. 3 fingers were bent at impossible angles. Broken, systematically. One joint at a time. Hans turned away from the window and vomited again. There was nothing left in his stomach, but his body kept heaving anyway. That night, Hans lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. He had lost 12 kilograms in the last 3 weeks. His uniform hung loose on his frame. His hands would not stop shaking. His left eye had developed a twitch that made him look like he was constantly winking. He had not slept more than 2 hours in any night since Klein started investigating sabotage. And now Kurt was dead. Dieter Hartmann was dead, and Hans was still alive, still free, still able to sabotage more rockets, because Kurt had died to protect that ability. March 4th, 1945. Aero 900 hours. A woman appeared at the gates of Peenemünde. She was thin and pale and carrying a canvas bag. The guards made her wait outside for 30 minutes while they checked her identification. Hans was walking past the gates on his way to the assembly hall when he saw her. He recognized her immediately. Greta Schneider, Kurt's wife, mother of Kurt's 3 children. Hans stopped walking. His legs would not move. Greta was arguing with the guards, demanding to see her husband, demanding to know why Kurt had not come home, demanding answers. One of the guards called for Klein. Hans should have kept walking, should have gone to his workstation, should have avoided this, but his legs carried him forward instead, toward the gates, toward Greta, toward the inevitable confrontation. Klein arrived and spoke to Greta briefly. Hans could not hear the words, but he saw Greta's face crumple, saw her knees buckle, saw Klein catch her arm to keep her from falling. Industrial accident, Klein said loudly enough for Hans to hear. Very tragic. The body has already been cremated. Standard procedure, nothing we could do. Greta turned and saw Hans standing 10 meters away. Her eyes locked onto his. "Hans," she called out. Her voice was breaking. "Hans, please. Tell me what happened to Kurt. You worked with him. You must know something." Hans walked forward. His mouth was dry. His heart was beating so hard it hurt. He reached the gate. Greta grabbed his hand through the metal bars. Her hands were cold. "Please," she whispered, "we have 3 children. They need to know what happened to their father." It was an industrial accident, Hans heard himself say. His voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. Kurt was working on a fuel system. There was an explosion. He did not suffer. It happened very quickly. Every word was a lie, Every word was ash in his mouth. Kurt had suffered for 6 hours. Kurt had screamed until his voice broke. Kurt had died slowly, while Klein broke his fingers one by one and asked questions Kurt refused to answer. Greta stared at Hans. She knew he was lying. Hans could see it in her eyes. But what could she do? She was a widow in Nazi Germany with 3 children to feed. She could not afford to ask too many questions. She could not afford to accuse SS officers of murder. So she nodded slowly, released Hans's hand, picked up her canvas bag. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Please, if you learn anything else, send word. My children deserve to know the truth." Then she turned and walked away down the road. Hans watched her go. He stood at the gate until she disappeared from view. Then he walked back to the assembly hall. His hands were not shaking anymore. They were numb. Everything was numb. As if his body had decided that feeling anything was too dangerous, so it was shutting down piece by piece. Hans sabotaged 3 gyroscopes that day. He did it mechanically, without thought, without emotion, just introducing tiny errors that would send rockets crashing into empty fields instead of London neighborhoods. He told himself he was honoring Kurt's sacrifice. He told himself Greta's children would grow up in a world with fewer rockets because their father had died protecting sabotage. He told himself the mathematics balanced, but the mathematics never balanced. They just accumulated. Deaths on one side, sabotaged rockets on the other, and no equation that made any of it make sense. Over the next 4 weeks, Hans sabotaged 18 more gyroscopes. Kurt's fuel system sabotage was being discovered now. Klein had engineers examining every fuel pump, looking for cracks, looking for weak welds, looking for anything that suggested sabotage. Klein found 27 defective fuel pumps. All bore Kurt's inspection signature. Klein announced that Kurt had been part of a sabotage cell, that there were other saboteurs still working at Peenemünde, that anyone with information should report immediately or be considered complicit. Hans kept his head down, kept calibrating gyroscopes, kept introducing tiny errors when the guards were distracted. But the psychological pressure was crushing him. He had lost 15 kilograms now. His hair was turning gray at 38 years old. The twitch in his left eye had become permanent. He stuttered when he spoke. At night he dreamed of Kurt screaming, of Greta staring at him through the gate, of Anna buried under rubble, of mathematics that added up to nothing but ash and bones and lies. On April 4th, 1945, something happened that Hans did not expect. A German newspaper was circulating through the technician quarters. Someone had smuggled it in despite regulations. The newspaper had a story about a V-2 that had crashed into the Thames River on March the 27th. The article described how the rocket had fallen 200 meters short of its intended target, how it had exploded in the water instead of on land, how a nearby school had been evacuated moments before the explosion because someone had spotted the rocket's vapor trail, how 200 children had been standing outside watching the Thames when the rocket hit the water, how they had cheered when they realized they were safe. Hans read the article 3 times. March the 27th. He checked his coded notebook. He had sabotaged a gyroscope on March 15th. That rocket would have been assembled by March 20th, launched by March 27th. Flight time from Peenemünde to London was approximately 5 minutes. The mathematics fit. The rocket that fell into the Thames could have been one of Hans's sabotaged units. The gyroscope error would have thrown off the trajectory by exactly the amount described. 200 meters. Not enough to save everyone, but enough to miss a school full of children. Hans sat on his bunk holding the newspaper with shaking hands. He could not prove it was his sabotaged rocket. The mathematics were not exact, but the possibility was there. 200 children. Alive because a gyroscope was 2 degrees off axis. Alive because Hans had introduced a tiny error that Klein had not caught. Alive because Kurt had died protecting Hans's ability to continue sabotaging. For the first time in 4 weeks, Hans felt something other than numbness. Not happiness, not relief. Just a small crack in the gray wall of despair. A faint possibility that the mathematics might eventually balance even if he never lived to see it. April 10, 1945. American troops entered Nordhausen and captured the Mittelwerk underground factory. April 17th, Soviet troops reached the Peenemünde area. Hans spent 3 days destroying evidence. He burned Kurt's notebook. He burned his own coded records. He dismantled tools he had modified for sabotage. He wiped down his workstation until there were no fingerprints, no traces, no proof. The war was ending. But Klein was still at Peenemünde, still watching, still suspicious. Hans saw Klein every day, saw Klein staring at him across the assembly hall. Klein knew. Hans was certain of it. Klein had no proof, but he knew. And Klein's eyes promised that this was not over, that someday, somehow, Klein would find proof. That patience was a weapon Klein wielded better than any torture device. On April 16th, 1 day before the Soviets arrived, Klein disappeared. Hans went to the assembly hall at 0600 hours, and the SS guards were gone. Klein's office was empty. Someone said Klein had fled west. Someone else said Klein had been recalled to Berlin. No one knew for certain. Klein had simply vanished. But Hans did not feel relief, because men like Klein did not vanish. They relocated, they changed names, they waited, and Hans would spend the rest of his life wondering if Klein was still out there, still searching, still promising that patience would eventually yield proof. April 17, 1945. Soviet troops entered Peenemünde. Hans and 47 other technicians were still at the facility. A Soviet officer appeared with 6 soldiers. "You are rocket engineers?" the officer asked in broken German. Hans nodded. "You will come with us. You will show us how rockets work." Hans nodded again. There was nothing else to do. The Soviets searched the facility for 3 days. They interrogated engineers. Hans answered questions. "Yes, I worked on guidance systems. Yes, I know how gyroscopes function. No, I never saw evidence of sabotage. No, I do not know why Kurt Schneider was executed. No, I do not know anything about defective rockets." The lies came easily now. Hans had been lying for so long that truth and lies had stopped feeling different. On April 22, 1945, Hans and 23 other engineers were loaded into trucks and driven east, away from Germany, toward an uncertain future. Hans sat in the back of the truck watching the German countryside disappear. He thought about Kurt, about Dieter Hartmann, about Anna, about Greta Schneider asking for truth he could never tell her, about 127 sabotaged rockets, about 200 children who cheered when a rocket fell into the Thames, about Klein's eyes promising that this was not over, about mathematics that balanced lives against lives and never came out even. The truck drove east for 3 days. Hans did not know where they were going. He only knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would never tell anyone what he had done. Not the Soviets. Not the Americans if they ever found him. Not his wife. Not his children. Not even Greta Schneider's children who deserved to know their father died a hero. Because heroes got medals and saboteurs got hanged. And Hans was both and neither. And the only way to survive was to carry the secret like a stone in his chest that grew heavier every year until it crushed him. May 2nd, 1945. Hans Friedrich stood in a line of 127 German rocket engineers in a warehouse in Nordhausen. American soldiers surrounded them with rifles. An American officer was walking down the line, studying faces, checking clipboards, making decisions about who was valuable and who was not. The valuable engineers would be taken to America. The others would be left for the Soviets. Hans had no idea which category he fell into. He had no idea if valuable was better than worthless. Both options terrified him. The American officer stopped in front of a Hans. Name: Hans Friedrich. Position: Guidance Systems Engineer. Specialization: Gyroscope calibration and trajectory calculations. The officer made a note on his clipboard. You worked at Peenemünde from 1941 to 1945? Yes. You were involved in V2 production? Yes. The officer circled something on the clipboard. Step to the right. Hans stepped to the right. 17 other engineers were already standing there, the valuable ones, the ones America wanted. Hans should have felt relief. Instead, he felt nothing. Operation Paperclip was the code name. The American program to extract German rocket scientists before the Soviets could claim them. The Americans wanted rocket technology. They wanted engineers who could build missiles. They wanted to win the next war before it started. Moral considerations were secondary. It did not matter that these men had built weapons that killed 9,000 civilians in London and Antwerp. It did not matter that V2 production had used slave labor from concentration camps. It did not matter that 12,000 prisoners had died building rockets in underground factories. What mattered was that German rocket technology was 10 years ahead of American technology, and America needed that advantage. June 20th, 1945. Hans boarded a U.S. Army transport plane at an airfield outside Munich. Destination: Fort Bliss, Texas. The plane was packed with German engineers. Some of them Hans recognized from Peenemünde. Others were strangers. No one spoke during the flight. Everyone understood that their value had an expiration date. The Americans wanted rocket knowledge. Once that knowledge was extracted, the engineers would become liabilities. Reminders of an uncomfortable alliance with men who had worked for Hitler. Fort Bliss was a military base in the middle of Texas desert. Hot, dry, flat in every direction. The German engineers were housed in barracks surrounded by barbed wire. Not prisoners exactly, but not free either. The Americans called them contractors. The guards called them Nazis. The engineers called themselves survivors. Hans was assigned to a team working on guidance systems for captured V2 rockets. The Americans had seized dozens of V2s from the Mittelwerk factory. Now they wanted to learn how to launch them, how to aim them, how to modify them for American use. Hans's supervisor was a U.S. Army captain named Robert Garrett. Garrett was 32 years old, an engineer himself, and deeply suspicious of every German in the program. During Hans's first interview, Garrett placed a folder on the desk between them. The folder contained Hans's work history. Peenemünde, 1941 to 1945. Guidance systems, gyroscope calibration, production oversight. Garrett opened the folder and pulled out a photograph. It showed a crater in London, a destroyed building, bodies being pulled from rubble. Your rockets did this, Garrett said quietly. Hans stared at the photograph. Yes. Garrett pulled out another photograph. This one showed the interior of the Mittelwerk factory. Emaciated prisoners in striped uniforms assembling rocket components. Were you aware that slave labor was used in V2 production? Garrett asked. Hans nodded. Yes, I was aware. Did you object? Hans shook his head. No, I did not object. It was the truth. Hans had known about the slave labor. Everyone at Peenemünde knew. Concentration camp prisoners were dying by the hundreds to build rockets in underground tunnels. Hans had done nothing to stop it. He had been too focused on his own private sabotage, too focused on miscalibrating gyroscopes to save London civilians. He had ignored the slaves dying 400 kilometers away because he could not save everyone. The mathematics did not allow it. So he had chosen London children over concentration camp prisoners, his own conscience over collective responsibility. And now Garrett was looking at him like he was a monster. And maybe Garrett was right. Garrett closed the folder. You are here because you have knowledge we need, but do not mistake that for forgiveness. You worked for Hitler. You built weapons that killed thousands. You participated in a system that murdered millions. The only reason you are not in prison is because your brain is temporarily more valuable than your punishment. Do you understand? Hans understood. He understood perfectly. He was a war criminal on probation. His freedom was conditional. His value was temporary. And the moment America finished extracting his knowledge, his value would drop to zero. Over the next 15 years, Hans worked on American rocket programs. He helped launch captured V-2s from White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. He helped design guidance systems for the Redstone rocket. He helped calculate trajectories for satellites and intercontinental ballistic missiles. And every day, FBI agents watched him. They read his mail. They listened to his phone calls. They interviewed his neighbors. They made sure everyone knew he was a Nazi, a war criminal, a man who built weapons that killed children. Meanwhile, other German engineers were celebrated. Werner von Braun, the architect of the V-2 program, became a celebrity. He appeared on television. He consulted for Disney. He was presented as a visionary who would put America into space. The fact that he had personally selected slave laborers for the Mittelwerk factory was quietly forgotten. The fact that he had been an SS officer was erased from official biographies. Von Braun was useful propaganda, living proof that German scientists had switched sides and were now loyal Americans. But Hans was not useful propaganda. Hans was just a mid-level engineer. Valuable enough to bring to America, but not important enough to rehabilitate publicly. So Hans lived in a strange limbo. Employed but supervised. Valued but suspected. Free but watched. And every day he carried the weight of two secrets. First, that he had sabotaged 127 rockets and saved hundreds of lives. Second, that he could never tell anyone about it, because saboteurs were traitors, and traitors were hanged. In 1960, Hans was transferred to NASA. The newly formed space agency needed engineers with rocket experience. Hans was assigned to the Saturn V program, the massive rocket that would eventually carry astronauts to the moon. Hans worked on guidance systems again, calculating trajectories, calibrating gyroscopes, making sure rockets flew exactly where they were aimed. The same skills he had used to sabotage V-2s were now being used to build the most ambitious rocket in human history. The irony was not lost on Hans. He had spent 4 years at Peenemünde introducing tiny errors to make rockets fail. Now he was spending years at NASA eliminating every possible error to make rockets succeed. The mathematics had reversed, but the work was the same. Hans's wife, Margaret, had joined him in America in 1952. She had waited 7 years in Germany before the State Department finally approved her visa. She asked Hans once about his work at Peenemünde, asked if he had known about the slave labor, asked if he had objected. Hans told her the same thing he had told Garrett. Yes, I knew. No, I did not object. Margaret never asked again. But Hans saw the way she looked at him sometimes, saw the questions in her eyes, saw the doubt. His wife believed he was a coward who had built weapons for Hitler and done nothing to stop the evil around him. And Hans could not tell her the truth, could not explain that he had sabotaged, could not reveal that he had risked his life every day for 4 years. because telling her would make her complicit, and complicit people were liabilities, and liabilities got you sent back to Germany to face war crimes tribunals. In 1969, Hans watched Apollo 11 launch from Cape Kennedy. The Saturn V rocket rose into the sky on a pillar of fire. Hans had worked on the guidance system for that rocket. His calculations had helped put men on the moon. It should have been the proudest moment of his career. Instead, Hans felt nothing, because he was standing 500 meters from the launch pad behind a chain-link fence. The NASA engineers were inside the control center. The press was in the VIP section. But Hans was behind a fence with other former Peenemünde engineers, the ones who were valuable enough to use but not respectable enough to celebrate, the ones whose past made them uncomfortable. As the Saturn V disappeared into the sky, Hans thought about Kurt Schneider, thought about Dieter Hartmann, thought about Greta Schneider asking for truth he could never tell her, thought about 127 sabotaged rockets, thought about 200 children cheering when a V-2 fell into the Thames instead of their school, thought about mathematics that balanced lives against lives and never came out even. The Saturn V would reach the moon in 4 days, but Hans would never escape Peenemünde. Hans Friedrich died on November 12, 1987, at age 80. Heart failure. He died in a small house in Huntsville, Alabama, surrounded by NASA engineers who tolerated him but never quite trusted him. His obituary in the local newspaper was 3 sentences long. Hans Friedrich, former German rocket engineer, died November 12th. He worked on the Saturn V guidance systems. He is survived by his wife Marguerite and son Thomas. No mention of sabotage, no mention of heroism. Just a quiet death for a man the world believed had been a Nazi. Thomas Friedrich was 42 years old when his father died. He had grown up in America. He spoke English without an accent. He had changed his name to Thomas Friedrich to sound less German. He had spent his childhood being called the Nazi's son in school, had spent his adulthood explaining that his father was not a war criminal, just an engineer who happened to work for the wrong side. Thomas had loved his father but also resented him. Resented the stigma. Resented the suspicion. Resented growing up as the child of a man everyone assumed was a monster. After Hans died, Thomas spent 2 weeks cleaning out his father's house, throwing away decades of accumulated junk, old clothes, old books, old engineering notebooks filled with calculations Thomas could not understand. On the 3rd day, Thomas found something interesting in the basement, a metal box hidden behind loose bricks in the foundation. The box was locked. Thomas broke the lock with a hammer. Inside was a notebook. The pages were yellowed and brittle. The writing was in German, dense, coded, impossible to read without a key. Thomas almost threw the notebook away, but something stopped him. His father had hidden this notebook, had gone to considerable effort to keep it secret. That meant it was important. So Thomas took the notebook to a translator, a German professor at the University of Alabama. The professor looked at the notebook and shook his head. This is not standard German. This is encoded. You would need a cryptographer, not a translator. Thomas took the notebook to 3 different cryptographers. All of them said the same thing. The code was sophisticated. Breaking it would take months, maybe years, and there was no guarantee the notebook contained anything worthwhile. Thomas put the notebook in a drawer and forgot about it for 28 years. In 2015, Thomas was 70 years old and retired. He was cleaning out his own house, preparing to downsize, when he found the notebook again. By now, technology had advanced. Code breaking was no longer the province of specialists with pencils and paper. Computers could analyze patterns. Machine learning could detect substitution ciphers. Thomas scanned the notebook and uploaded it to a website that specialized in historical code breaking. 3 months later, the website sent him an email. "We cracked your code." The notebook contains detailed records of industrial sabotage during World War II. "We think you should contact a historian." Thomas contacted Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a historian at the Imperial War Museum in London who specialized in V-2 rocket attacks. Dr. Mitchell agreed to examine the notebook. Thomas mailed her the original. 2 weeks later, Dr. Mitchell called Thomas. Her voice was shaking. "Mr. Friedrich, I need you to sit down. What I'm about to tell you will change everything you thought you knew about your father." Thomas sat down. Dr. Mitchell continued. "Your father's notebook contains records of 127 sabotaged V-2 rockets. Each entry includes the date, the rocket serial number, and the type of sabotage: gyroscope miscalibrations, fuel pump defects, electrical system failures." He kept detailed records of every rocket he sabotaged from September 1944 to April 1945. Thomas said nothing. He could not speak. Dr. Mitchell continued. "We cross-referenced your father's records with British archives of V-2 impacts. The correlation is extraordinary. At least 89 of the rockets your father sabotaged missed their intended targets by significant margins. Some fell into the Thames. Some exploded in empty fields. Some crashed before reaching London. We estimate that your father's sabotage saved between 2,000 and 3,000 lives. Conservatively, the actual number could be much higher." Thomas started crying. He was 70 years old and he was crying like a child, because his father had not been a Nazi. His father had been a hero. His father had risked his life every day for 8 months. His father had saved thousands of people, and his father had carried that secret for 42 years, had died without telling anyone, had let the world believe he was a coward, because telling the truth would have endangered his family, because saboteurs were traitors, because heroes got medals and traitors got hanged, and Hans Friedrich had been both and neither. Dr. Mitchell's research was published in 2016. The findings made international news. German engineers secretly sabotaged Nazi rockets, saved thousands. The story appeared in the New York Times, the BBC, Der Spiegel. Historians debated the details. Some questioned the numbers. Others pointed out that Hans's sabotage had come at a cost, that slaves had died building the rockets Hans sabotaged, that Dieter Hartmann had been executed for sabotage he did not commit, that Kurt Schneider had been tortured to death. The mathematics were complicated, the morality was messy, but nobody disputed the central fact. Hans Friedrich had sabotaged 127 rockets, and those rockets had not killed anyone. In 2018, the German government issued a posthumous pardon for Hans Friedrich, recognizing his actions as resistance against the Nazi regime. In 2019, the Imperial War Museum in London installed a plaque honoring Hans Friedrich and Kurt Schneider as saboteurs who saved British lives. In 2020, Thomas Friedrich published a book about his father, the engineer who sabotaged Hitler's rockets. The book became a bestseller in Germany, England, and America. But Hans Friedrich never knew any of this. He died in 1987, believing the world thought he was a Nazi. He died carrying the weight of 127 sabotaged rockets like a stone in his chest. He died without knowing that his son would one day read his coded notebook and learn the truth. He died without knowing that historians would calculate the lives he saved. He died without knowing that his name would be remembered as a hero instead of a war criminal. Thomas Friedrich is 78 years old now. He keeps his father's notebook in a safe. Sometimes he takes it out and reads the entries. September 15, 1944. Rocket A-1347. Gyroscope bearing loosened. Trajectory error estimated 3 kilometers. October 2, 1944. Rocket A-1402. Fuel pump valve weakened. Premature engine cutoff expected. November 8, 1944. Rocket A-1511. Electrical relay contact gap increased. Guidance failure probable. Page after page of careful sabotage. Each entry representing 3 or 4 lives saved. Maybe more. The mathematics were impossible to calculate precisely, but they were better than 0, and in the end, better than 0 was enough.